Everybody. This is just a piece from Roman Rosdolsky's The Making of Marx's Capital, Volume 2. And he has in the conclusion of the book, which is part 6 of the book, he has a chapter titled The Historical Limits of the Law of Value, Marx on the Subject of Socialist Society. And I want to, I've read this book before, and it's one of those books that could probably, because of just like the importance of Rosdolsky and Marx reception, it would be worthwhile to reread entirely. I'm not really in a position in terms of my life right now to dedicate a whole lot of time to reading this whole book, but I do want to reread this section from it because I think it might be of relevance to my personal academic research. So here we go. The historical limits of the law of value, Marx on the subject of socialist society. I'm probably going to make this 2 videos because it's there's a lot of text on each individual page, and it's like 30 pages or something like that. So I'm assuming these videos could be a bit long if I don't do that. Anyway, the historical limits of the law of value, Marx on the subject of socialist society. According to Marx's original outline, the last book of his work was to conclude with an examination of those moments which, quote, point beyond the presupposition, end quote. Marx, and, quote, drive towards the adoption of a new historical form, end quote, Marx. That is, it was intended to deal with the, quote, dissolution of the mode of production based on exchange value, end quote, and its transition to socialism. Footnote, see Grundrisse, page 228 and 264, end footnote. The central focus of this was naturally the question of the destiny of the law of value, and it is to this subject that we now turn our attention. Section 1. Marx on the development of human individuality under capitalism. It is well known that the founders of Marxism rejected all forms of, quote, depicting the future, end quote, inasmuch as this involved the construction of completed socialist systems, to be derived from, quote, the eternal principles of justice, end quote, and the, quote, immutable laws of human nature, end quote. Although such systems may have been necessary and justified in those periods when they were first expounded, they developed into a hindrance to the growing workers' movement as soon as it had acquired a scientific basis in the materialist interpretation of history established by Marx and Engels. This basis was far superior to the doctrines of the utopian socialists and to pose the question of a socialist conception of the future in a radically different way. Socialism no longer appeared as a mere ideal, but as a necessary phase in the development of humanity, the real culmination of all previous history. Consequently, the socialist society of the future could only be spoken of inasmuch as visible seeds of this new social form could be discovered in history and its developmental tendencies. This does not, of course, mean that Marx and Engels had no conception of the socialist economic and social order, a view often attributed to them by opportunists, or that they simply left the entire matter to our grandchildren, as if this constituted the scientific character of their theories. On the contrary, such conceptions played a prominent role in Marx's theoretical system. This can be convincingly shown if we examine the main works of the founders of Marxism. Take, for example, Marx's Capital, which sought to investigate the inner structure and laws of motion of the capitalist mode of production and to produce the proof and necessity of the, quote, great change, which was to bring about the abolition of human, quote, self-alienation, through which humanity would become the, quote, real conscious rulers of nature and their own association, end quote. Engels. We therefore constantly encounter discussions and remarks in Capital and the works preparatory to Capital, which are concerned with the problems of a socialist society, and which make especially clear both that what Marx had in common with the theories of the utopian socialists and where Marx differed from them. These discussions were a necessary product of Marx's dialectical and material method, which sought to grasp every social phenomenon in the flow of that social phenomenon's becoming, existence, and passing away. This method therefore directs our attention both to, quote, earlier historical modes of production, end quote, and looks forward to those points, quote, at which the suspension of the present form of production relations gives signs of its becoming, foreshadowing the future, just as, on the one side, the pre-bourgeois phases appear as merely historical, i.e. suspended presuppositions, so do the contemporary conditions of production likewise appear as engaged in suspending themselves, and hence in positing the historic presuppositions for a new state of society, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Thus, the dialectical materialist study of the capitalist mode of production leads directly to counterposing this mode of production, on the one hand, to pre-capitalist social formations, and on the other to the socialist social order which replaces it. Quote, the private exchange of all products of labor, all activities, and all wealth stands in antithesis not only to a distribution based on a natural or political super and subordination of individuals to one another, parenthesis, regardless of the character of this super and subordination, patriarchal, ancient, or feudal, end parenthesis, but also to free exchange among individuals who are associated on the basis of common appropriation and control of the means of production, end quote. Grundrisse. This yields a division of the whole of human history into three stages, in the form of a dialectical triad, quote, relations of personal dependence, parenthesis, entirely spontaneous at the outset, end parenthesis, are the first social forms, in which human productive capacity develops only to a slight extent and at isolated points. Personal independence founded on objective dependencies is the second great form, in which the system of general social metabolism, of universal relations, of all-round needs and universal capacities is formed for the first time. Free individuality, based on the universal development of individuals and on the subordination of their communal social productivity as their social wealth, is the third stage. The second stage creates the conditions for the third, end quote. And this is just a side note from me, the reader. The first stage is associated with, say, feudalism and slavery. The second stage is capitalism, and the third stage is communism, right? So there's like a progressive development of like the individual in bourgeois society. That's how I interpret it, at least. You may interpret it differently. Human history is therefore seen in terms of human history's most basic final outcome as a necessary process of the elaboration and development of the human personality and the human personality's freedom. However, from Marx's point of view, the issue is not so much to demonstrate the necessity of this process, parenthesis, this is already recognized by classical German philosophy, in parenthesis, but rather to liberate this discovery from ideological illusions and place this discovery on the firm foundation of real history, i.e. the development of the social relations of production. This task can be only accomplished with the assistance of the materialist method. The rough draft. If you don't know, the rough draft is what Rosdolsky refers to as is how what Rosdolsky calls the Grundrisse. In the rough draft states, quote, when we look at social relations which create an undeveloped system of exchange values and of money, bracket, i.e. pre-capitalist relations, end bracket, ... then it is clear from the outset that the individuals in such a society, although their relations appear to be more personal, enter into connection with one another only as individuals, imprisoned within a certain definition, as feudal lord and vassal, landlord and serf, etc., or as members of a caste, etc., or as members of an estate, etc. In the money relation, in the developed system of exchange, and this semblance seduces the Democrats, and this semblance seduces the Democrats, in parentheses. The ties of personal dependence, of distinctions of blood, education, etc., are in fact exploded, ripped up, ... and individuals seem independent, ... free to collide with one another and to engage in exchange within this freedom, but they appear thus only for someone who abstracts from the conditions. For someone, they appear as free with someone who abstracts from the conditions of existence within which these individuals enter into contact. ... The definedness of individuals, which in the former case appears as a personal restriction of the individual by another individual, appears in the latter case as developed into an objective restriction of the individual by relations independent of the individual and sufficient unto themselves. Side note for me, heteronymous forces. Continuing on with the Marx quote. Since the single individual cannot strip away the single individual's personal definition, but may well overcome and master external relations, the single individual's freedom seems to be greater in case 2. A closer examination of these external relations, these conditions, shows, however, that it is impossible for the individuals of a class, etc., to overcome them in mass without destroying these external relations, these conditions. A particular individual may by chance get on top of these relations, but the mass of those under these relations rule cannot. Since the mass of those under this relation's rule, mere existence expresses subordination, the necessary subordination of the mass of the individuals. These external relations are very far from being an abolition of, quote, relations of dependence, end quote. They are rather the dissolution of these relations into a general form. They are merely the elaboration and emergence of the general foundation of the relations of personal dependence, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Footnote. Marx adds, quote, this is an independence which is at bottom merely an illusion, and it is more correctly called indifference, end quote. Marx, and footnote. Footnote. We read further on in the text, quote, these objective dependency relations also appear in antithesis to those of personal dependence. The objective dependency relation is nothing more than social relations which have become independent and now enter into opposition to the seemingly independent individuals, i.e., the reciprocal relations of production separated from and autonomous of individuals. In such a way that individuals are now ruled by abstractions, whereas earlier individuals depended on one another. The abstraction or idea, however, is nothing more than the theoretical expression of those material relations which are their lord and master. Relations can be expressed, of course, only in ideas, and thus philosophers have determined the reign of ideas to be the peculiarity of the new age, and have identified the creation of free individuality with the overthrow of this reign. This error was all the more easily committed from the ideological standpoint, as this reign exercised by the relations, parenthesis, this objective dependency, which incidentally turns into definite relations of personal dependency, but stripped of all illusions, end parenthesis, appears within the consciousness of individuals as the reign of ideas, and appears within the consciousness of individuals as the reign of ideas, and because the belief in the permanence of these ideas, i.e., these objective relations, of dependency is, of course, consolidated, nourished, and inculcated by the ruling classes by all means available, end quote. Grundrisse. See also German Ideology, page 49, and footnote. We read in a marginal note to the examination of the, quote, objective power of money, end quote, in the rough draft, Grundrisse. Quote, it has been said and may be said that this is precisely the beauty and greatness of it. This spontaneous interconnection, this material and mental metabolism which is independent of the knowing and willing of individuals, and which presupposes their reciprocal independence and indifference. And certainly this objective connection is preferable to the lack of any connection, or to a merely local connection resting on blood ties, or on primeval natural or master-servant relations. Equally certain is that individuals cannot gain mastery over their own social interconnections before individuals have created their own social interconnections. But it is an insipid notion to conceive of this merely objective bond as a spontaneous natural attribute inherent in individuals and inseparable from individuals' nature, ... This bond is the individual's product. This bond is a historic product. This bond belongs to a specific phase of the individual's development. The alien and independent character in which this bond presently exists, vis-a-vis individuals, proves only that the individuals are still engaged in the creation of conditions of their social life, and that individuals have not yet begun, on the basis of these conditions, to live their social life. It is the bond of individuals within specific and limited relations of production, end quote. However, quote, in earlier stages of development, the single individual seems to be developed more fully, because the single individual has not yet worked out his relationships in their fullness, or erected them as independent social powers and relations opposite to him. It is as ridiculous to yearn for a return to that original fullness as it is to believe that with this complete emptiness, end quote, which characterizes the, quote, new age, end quote, history has come to a standstill. Footnote. Marx writes in similar vein in Capital on the subject of the modern machine operator, quote, even the lightening of the labor becomes an instrument of torture, since the machine does not free the worker from the work, but rather deprives the work itself of all content, ... The special skill of each individual machine operator, who has now been deprived of all significance, vanishes as an infinitesimal quantity in the face of the science, the gigantic natural forces, and the massive social labor embodied in the system of machinery, which, together with those three forces, constitute the power of the, quote, master, end quote. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Footnote. See contributions. Quote, so little does the relation of buyer and seller represent a purely individual relationship that buyer and seller enter into it only insofar as the buyer and seller's individual labor is negated, that is to say, turned into money as non-individual labor. It is therefore as absurd to regard buyer and seller, these bourgeois economic types, as eternal social forms of human individuality, as it is preposterous to weep over buyer and seller as signifying the abolition of individuality, end quote. Marx, Contribution to Critique of Political Economy. It is interesting to note that a similar passage can be found in the works of the young Hegel. In his text, The German Constitution, from 1798 to 1799, which survives only as fragments, Hegel writes on the subject of early pre-constitutional, quote, German freedom, end quote. Quote, just as it is cowardly and effete to describe the men of that society as loathsome, wretched, and stupid, and to imagine ourselves to be infinitely more human, happy, and clever, so too it is childish and silly to yearn for such a society, as if it alone were natural, or to fail to recognize that a society ruled by law is necessary, and that a society ruled by law alone is free, end quote. Quoted in Lukács, the young Hegel. End footnote. That quote was from Hegel. The bourgeois viewpoint has never advanced beyond this antithesis between itself and the romantic viewpoint, and therefore this romantic viewpoint will accompany the bourgeois viewpoint as a legitimate antithesis Shit, did I miss something? Is this still a quote? I'm not sure. I think this is still a quote. I thought the quote ended. My bad. The bourgeois viewpoint has never advanced beyond this antithesis between the bourgeois viewpoint and this romantic viewpoint, and therefore the romantic viewpoint will accompany the bourgeois viewpoint as legitimate antithesis up to the bourgeois viewpoint's end. Blessed end, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. The main defect with the bourgeois concept of freedom is now clear. It is the unhistorical approach of the bourgeois concept of freedom's advocates, who regard the development of individuality, which is specific to one particular epoch and one particular mode of production, as being absolute, and confuse this with the realization of, quote, freedom tout court, end quote, or freedom as such. I think that's what freedom tout court means. Parenthesis, quote, just like a man who believes in a particular religion and sees his particular religion as the religion, and everything outside of the religion as false religions, end quote. Marx, Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 2, end quote, end parenthesis. The advocates of the bourgeois concept of freedom simply fail to grasp that bourgeois freedom, far from representing the embodiment of, quote, freedom in general, end quote, is rather a highly specific product of the capitalist mode of production, and consequently shares all the capitalist mode of production's limitations. For human beings, having been liberated from earlier limitations, are subject to a new fetter under capitalism, namely the reified rule of their relations of production, which have grown up over them, the blind power of competition and chance. Footnote. See Marx's St. Max, Stirner. Quote, it has already been pointed out to Stirner that in competition, personality itself is a matter of chance, while chance is personality, end quote. Marx, German Ideology. End footnote. In one respect, human beings have become freer, but in another respect, human beings have become less free. This unhistorical mode of thinking is shown most clearly in the attitude of bourgeois economists and bourgeois ideologists in general towards capitalist competition, Marx says that although competition, quote, appears historically as the dissolution of compulsory guild membership, government regulation, internal tariffs, and the like within a country, as the lifting of blockades, prohibitions, and protection on the world market, end quote. Competition has never, quote, been examined for this merely negative side, ... competition's merely historical side, ... And this has led at the same time to the even greater absurdity of regarding competition as the collision of unfettered individuals who are determined only by those unfettered individuals' own interests, as the mutual repulsion and attraction of free individuals, and hence as the absolute mode of existence of free individuality in the sphere of consumption and of exchange, end quote. Marx. Quote, nothing can be more mistaken, end quote, Marx adds. For, in the first place, quote, while free competition has dissolved the barriers of earlier relations and modes of production, it is necessary to observe, first of all, that the things which were a barrier to free competition were the inherent limits of the earlier mode of production within which they spontaneously developed and moved. The limits became barriers only after the forces of production and the relations of intercourse had developed sufficiently to enable capital as such to emerge as the dominant principle of production. The limits which it tore down were barriers to capital's motion, capital's development, and capital's realization. It is by no means the case that capital thereby suspended all limits, nor all barriers, but rather only the limits not corresponding to capital, which were barriers to capital. Within capital's own limits, footnote, this instance, parenthesis, the mutual relation between, quote, limit and, quote, barrier also illustrates the use of Hegelian concepts, end footnote. Within capital's own limits, however much they may appear as barriers from a higher standpoint, ... capital feels free and free of barriers, i.e. is limited only by capital's self, only by capital's own conditions of life. Exactly as guild industry, in guild industry's heyday, found in the guild organization all the fullness of freedom guild industry required, i.e. the relations of production corresponding to guild industry. After all, it posited these out of itself and developed them as guild industry's inherent conditions, and hence in no way as external and constricting barriers. The historical side of the negation of the guild system, etc., by capital, through free competition, signifies nothing more than that capital, having become sufficiently strong by means of the mode of intercourse adequate to capital's self, tore down the historic barriers which hindered and blocked the movement adequate to capital. End quote. Nevertheless, competition has by no means only this negative, merely historical significance. Competition is, in essence, the realization of the capitalist mode of production! Exclamation point. Footnote. In Marx's terminology, this applies especially to the young Marx. The, quote, general is in no way identical to the, quote, communal, but rather refers to what arises from the collision of, quote, communal and, quote, particular interest in a society of atomized private owners. See German Ideology, page 46, quote, just because individuals seek only their particular interest, which for the individuals does not coincide with the individual's communal interest, bracket, in fact the general is the illusory form of communal life, end bracket. Their communal interest will be imposed on them as an interest, quote, alien to them, and independent of them, as in its turn a particular, peculiar, quote, general interest, end quote, end quote. German Ideology. End footnote. For, quote, where am I? One second. Did I read the wrong footnote? Where am I? Okay. Thus the statement, quote, within free competition, the individuals, in following purely the individual's private interest, realize the communal or rather the general interest, end quote, simply expresses an illusion. For, quote, it is not individuals who are set free by free competition. It is rather capital which is set free. As long as production resting on capital is the necessary, hence the fittest form for the development of the force of social production, the movement of individuals within the pure conditions of capital appears as their freedom, which is then also dogmatically propounded as such through constant reflection back on the barriers torn down by free competition. End quote. Marx. Footnote. Marx adds, quote, by the way, when the illusion about competition as the so-called absolute form of free individuality vanishes, this is evidence that the conditions of competition, i.e. of production founded on capital, are already felt and thought of as barriers, and hence already are such, and more become such, end quote. End footnote. Hence, quote, the insipidity of the view that free competition is the ultimate development of human freedom, and that the negation of free competition is equal to the negation of individual freedom and of social production based on individual freedom. It is nothing more than free development on a limited basis, the basis of the rule of capital. This kind of individual freedom is therefore at the same time the most complete abolition of individual freedom and the most complete subjugation of individuality under social conditions which assume the form of objective powers, even of overpowering objects. The analysis of what free competition really is the only rational reply to the middle-class prophets who laud free competition to the skies, or to the socialists who damn free competition to hell, end quote. Footnote, that is, the Proudhonist, end footnote. In fact, quote, the assertion that free competition equals the ultimate form of the development of the forces of production, and hence of human freedom, means nothing other than that middle-class rule is the culmination of world history, certainly an agreeable thought for the parvenus of the day before yesterday, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. It is clear that what we are reading here is simply a continuation of ideas previously encountered in the German ideology, namely that in the course of human history, the development of the productive forces has created a situation in which the original personal relations of dependence have been replaced by simple objective ones, and where the local and national social connection between people has been replaced by a universal connection. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels already pointed to the contradictory and two-sided character of previous social process, which on the one hand gave rise to the creation of a social individual, more capable of development and with abundant needs, but on the other hand produced the most extensive, quote, alienation and, quote, emptying of this individual. And finally, we also find the argument according to which the liberation of mankind from feudal and other constraints by capitalism produces an apparent freedom only, and complete freedom, The, quote, original and free development of individuals, end quote, will only become a reality under communism. We read in the German ideology, quote, in imagination, individuals seem freer under the dominance of the bourgeoisie than before, because their conditions of life seem accidental. In reality, of course, they are less free because they are more subjected to the violence of things, end quote. German ideology. And it was just, quote, this right to the undisturbed enjoyment within certain conditions of fortuity and chance, bracket, which, end bracket, has up to now been called personal freedom, end quote. German ideology. This conception is developed further in the rough draft, Grundrisse, except that the alternative, positive aspect of the contradiction, the actual progress which, quote, apparent bourgeois freedom, end quote, brings about, is expressed much more clearly and emphatically. This is best seen in the remarkable passage dealing with the, quote, childish world of antiquity, end quote, in antithesis to the modern world of capitalism. Marx says there, quote, do we never find in antiquity an inquiry into which form of landed property, etc., is the most productive, creates the greatest wealth? Wealth does not appear as the aim of production, although Cato may well investigate which manner of cultivating a field brings the greatest rewards, and Brutus may even lend out his money at the best rates of interest. The question is always which mode of property creates the best citizens, end quote. The situation is completely different in the modern world. Here wealth, quote, appears in all forms in the shape of a thing, be it an object or be it a relation mediated through the object, which is external and accidental to the individual. Thus the old view in which the human being appears as the aim of production, regardless of his limited national, religious, political character, seems to be very lofty when contrasted to the modern world, where production appears as the aim of mankind and wealth as the aim of production. In fact, however, when the limited bourgeois form is stripped away, what is wealth other than the universality of individual needs, capacities, pleasures, productive forces, etc., created through universal exchange? The full development of human mastery over the forces of nature, those of so-called nature as well as humanity's own nature. The absolute working out of his creative potentialities, with no presupposition other than previous historic development, which makes this totality of development, i.e. the development of all human powers as such, the end in itself, not as measured on a predetermined yardstick, where he does not reproduce himself in one specificity, but produces his totality, strives not to remain something he has become, but is in the absolute movement of becoming. In bourgeois economics, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete working out of the human content appears as a complete emptying out. This universal objectification as total alienation, and the tearing down of all limited, one-sided aims as sacrifice of the human end in itself to an entirely external end. This is why the childish world of antiquity appears on the one side as loftier. On the other side, it really is loftier in all matters, where closed shapes, forms, and given limits are sought for. It is satisfaction from a limited standpoint, while the modern age gives no satisfaction, or where it appears satisfied with itself, it is vulgar, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Footnote, quote, what then constitutes the alienation of labor? First, the fact that labor is external to the worker, i.e., labor does not belong to the worker's essential being, that in the worker's work, therefore, the worker does not affirm the worker's self, but denies the worker's self, does not feel content, but unhappy, does not develop freely the worker's physical and mental energy, but mortifies the worker's body and ruins the worker's mind. The worker therefore only feels himself outside his work, and the worker's work feels outside himself. The worker is at home when he is not working, and when he is working, he is not at home." End quote. Marx. This state of affairs produces an inversion of all human values in capitalism. Quote, "What is animal becomes human, and what is human becomes animal. Certainly eating, drinking, procreating, etc. are also genuine functions, but abstractly taken, separated from the sphere of human activity and turned into sole ultimate ends, they are animal functions." End quote. Marx, Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts. End footnote. The antithesis between the Marxist and the Romantic critique of capitalism is expressed here with particular clarity. Marx did not just attack the Romantics because of the Romantics' quote, "sentimental tears," end quote, or because the Romantics, quote, "waved the alms bag of the proletariat in front for a banner," end quote, for demagogic reasons, while at the same time hiding the, quote, "old feudal coat of arms," end quote, behind their backs. Footnote, see Communist Manifesto. Marx reproached the Romantics much more with being totally incapable of grasping the, quote, "course of modern history," end quote, i.e. the necessity and the historical progressiveness of the bourgeois social order, which the Romantics criticized, and for confining the Romantic selves instead to moralistic rejection of modern history. A moralistic rejection of the bourgeois social order. No one would deny that the rule of capital is based on the most callous extraction of surplus labor, on the exploitation and oppression of the mass of the people. In this respect, the rule of capital certainly, quote, "surpasses all previous systems of production, which were based on directly compulsory labor in its energy and its quality of unbounded and ruthless activity," end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. But only capital has, quote, "subjugated historical progress to the service of wealth," end quote. It is only the capitalist form of production which, quote, "becomes an epoch-making mode of exploitation, which in the course of its historical development revolutionizes, through the organization of the labor process and the enormous improvement of techniques, the entire economic structure of society in a manner eclipsing all former epochs," end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 2. Capitalist production is therefore radically different from all previous modes of production by virtue of the capitalist mode of production's universal character. The capitalist production's drive to continually revolutionize the material forces of production. If pre-capitalist stages of production were never able to increase labor beyond that required for immediate subsistence, due to the pre-capitalist stages of production's primitive, undeveloped techniques, then the, quote, "great historic aspect of capital," end quote, consists in the fact that capital, quote, "produces surplus labor, surplus from the standpoint of simple use value, of mere subsistence," end quote. And capital carries out this task by developing, on the one hand, the social forces of production, and on the other, human needs and capacities for labor, to an extent that has never existed before. A particularly striking passage from the Grundrisse reads as follows, quote, "The historic destiny of capital is fulfilled as soon as, on the one side, there has been such a development of needs that surplus labor above and beyond necessity has itself become a general need arising out of individual needs themselves, and on the other, when the severe discipline of capital, acting on succeeding generations, has developed general industriousness as a general property of the new species," end quote. Marx. And finally, quote, when the development of the productive powers of labor, which capital incessantly whips onward with capital's unlimited mania for wealth, and of the sole conditions in which this mania can be realized, have flourished to the stage where the possession and preservation of general wealth requires a lesser labor time of society as a whole, and where the laboring society relates scientifically to the process of its progressive reproduction in a constantly greater abundance, hence where labor in which a human being does what a thing could do for him instead has ceased, ... Capital's ceaseless striving towards the general form of wealth drives labor beyond the limits of labor's natural paltriness, and thus creates the material conditions for the development of the rich individuality, which is all-sided in that rich individuality's production as in that rich individuality's consumption, and whose labor also appears, therefore, no longer as labor, but as the full development of activity itself, in which natural necessity, in natural necessity's direct form, has disappeared, because a historically created need has taken the place of a natural need. This is why capital is productive, an essential relation for the development of the social productive forces. This is why capital is productive, an essential relation for the development of the social productive forces. Capital ceases to exist as such only where the development of these productive forces themselves encounters the development of these productive forces themselves barriers in capital itself. End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. There's a couple footnotes. Footnote. We read in another passage in the Grundrisse that capital, quote, correctly understood appears as the condition of the development of the forces of production, as long as the forces of production require an external spur, which appears at the same time as the forces of production's bridle. It is a discipline over the forces of production, which becomes superfluous and burdensome at a certain level of the forces of production's development, just like the guild, etc. End quote. Marx, Grundrisse.
There's these fans at the baseball game.
Footnote. Quote, labor, says Marx, quote, is free in all civilized countries. The point is not to free it, but to abolish it. End quote. Marx, German Ideology. See Marcuse, Reason and Revolution. Quote, Marx envisioned the future mode of labor to be so different from the prevailing mode of labor that Marx hesitated to use the same term, quote, labor, to designate alike the material process of capitalist and communist society, end quote. End footnote. In other words, whereas all previous modes of production had to be content with a situation in which the forces of production progressed only very slowly, or even remained stationary over long periods, capital proceeds directly, quote, from the constant overthrow of capital's prevailing presuppositions as the presupposition of capital's reproduction, ... Although limited by its very nature, capital strives towards the universal development of the forces of production, and thus becomes the presupposition of a new mode of production, which is founded not on the development of the forces of production for the purpose of reproducing or at most expanding a given condition, but where the free, unobstructed, progressive, and universal development of the forces of production is itself the presupposition of society, and hence of its reproduction, where advance beyond the point of departure is the only presupposition, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Only on this new foundation does the, quote, universality of the individual, end quote, become possible. Quote, not an ideal or imagined universality, but the universality of his real and ideal relations. Hence also the grasping of the individual's own history as a process and the recognition of nature, equally present as practical power over nature, as his real body. End quote. Grundrisse. Thus, it is the development of capitalism itself which lays the basis for the resolution of the problem of the human personality and human freedom which is posed by history. And seen from this perspective, the historic achievement of capital, which Marx himself pointed to so often and so forcefully, cannot be emphasized enough. One second. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to cut the video in half here. So the next half, we'll start with the section 2, which is titled "The Role of Machinery as the Material Precondition of Socialist Society." Thanks for listening. New section, section 2. The role of machinery as the material precondition of socialist society. Marx states in the rough draft, the Grundrisse, quote, "If we did not find concealed in society, as society is, the material conditions of production and the corresponding relations of exchange prerequisite for a classless society, then all attempts to explode," end quote, existing society, quote, would be quixotic, unquote, or quixotic, as in like Don Quixote. I think that's like the reference there. What are then the material conditions of production which render the transition to a classless society both possible and necessary? Wait, did I say end quote? End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. What are then the material conditions of production which render the transition to a classless society both possible and necessary? The answer is to be found primarily in Marx's analysis of the role of machinery, which shows us on the one hand how the development of automatic systems of machinery debases the individual worker to the level of a partial tool, a mere moment in the labor process, but also, on the other hand, how this very same development simultaneously creates the preconditions for the reduction of the expenditure of human energy in the production process to a minimum, and further, that this process permits the replacement of the one-sided worker of today by all-round developed individuals, for whom, quote, the different social functions are interchangeable modes of activity, end quote. Grundrisse. All this can be found in both Capital Volume 1 and the Rough Draft. However, the Rough Draft, Grundrisse, also contains discussions on machinery which are not in Capital, and which, despite the fact that they were written more than 100 years ago, still generate a feeling of awe and excitement, containing as they do some of the boldest visions attained by the human imagination. Marx writes, quote, "The exchange of living labor for objectified labor, i.e. the positing of social labor in the form of the contradiction of capital and wage labor, is the ultimate development of the value relation, and of production resting on value. Its presupposition is, and remains, the mass of direct labor time, the quantity of labor employed, as the determinate factor in the production of wealth. But to the degree that large industry develops, the creation of real wealth comes to depend less on labor time and on the amount of labor employed than on the power of the agencies set in motion during labor time, whose powerful effectiveness is ... out in motion during labor time, whose powerful effectiveness it is ... out of all proportion to the direct labor time spent on their production, but depends rather on the general state of science and on the progress of technology, or the application of this science to production, ... Real wealth manifests itself, rather, and large industry reveals this, in the monstrous disproportion between the labor time applied and labor time's product, as well as in the qualitative imbalance between labor, reduced to pure abstraction, and the power of the production process it superintends. Labor no longer appears so much to be included within the production process. Rather, the human being comes more to relate as watchman and regulator to the production process itself, ... No longer does the worker insert a modified natural thing as middle link between the object and himself. Rather, he inserts the process of nature, transformed into an industrial process, as a means between himself and inorganic nature, mastering it. He steps to the side of the production process instead of being the production process's chief actor. In this transformation, where am I? He steps to the side of the production process instead of being this production process's chief actor. In this transformation, it is neither the direct human labor he himself performs, nor the time during which he works, but rather the appropriation of his own general productive power, his understanding of nature and his mastery over nature by virtue of his presence as a social body. It is, in a word, the development of the social individual which appears as the great foundation stone and of production, the great foundation stone of production and of wealth. The theft of alien labor time on which the present wealth is based. The theft of alien labor time on which the present wealth is based appears a miserable foundation in face of this new foundation, created by large-scale industry itself. As soon as labor in the direct form ceases to be the great wellspring of wealth, labor time ceases to be labor's measure. Wealth's measure. And hence exchange value, must cease to be the measure, of use value. The surplus labor of the mass has ceased to be the condition for the development of general wealth, just as the non-labor of the few, for the development of the general powers of the human head. With that, production based on exchange value breaks down, and the direct material production process is stripped of the form of penury and antithesis. The free development of individualities, and hence not the reduction of necessary labor time so as to posit surplus labor, but rather the general reduction of the necessary labor of society to a minimum, which then corresponds to the artistic, scientific, etc. development of the individuals in the time set free, and with the means created for all of them. End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Another section from the rough draft, Grundrisse, reads, quote, the creation of a large quantity of disposable time, apart from necessary labor time for society generally and each of its members, i.e. room for the development of the individual's full productive forces, hence those of society also, This creation of not labor time appears in the stage of capital, as of all earlier ones, as not labor time, free time for a few. What capital adds is that it increases the surplus labor time of the mass by all the means of art and science, because its wealth consists directly in the appropriation of surplus labor time. Since valued directly its purpose, not use value. Since value is directly its purpose, not use value. I think there might be a typo there. I'm trying to recorrect it to make sense. It is thus, despite itself, instrumental in creating the means of social disposable time. in order to reduce labor time for the whole society to a diminishing minimum, and thus to free everyone's time for their own development. But its tendency always, on the one side, to create disposable time, on the other to convert disposable time into surplus labor. To create disposable time on the other side into surplus labor. I fucked up that sentence. But its tendency always, on the one side, to create disposable time, on the other to convert disposable time into surplus labor. If it succeeds too well at the first, then it suffers from surplus production, and then necessary labor is interrupted, because no surplus labor can be realized by capital. If it succeeds too well at the first, then it suffers from surplus production, and then necessary labor is interrupted, because no surplus labor can be realized by capital. Footnote. See Capital Volume 3. Quote, overproduction of capital is never anything more than overproduction of means of production, of means of labor and necessities of life, which may serve as capital, i.e. it may serve to exploit labor at a given degree of exploitation. A fall in the intensity of exploitation below a certain point, however, calls forth disturbances and stoppages in the capitalist production process, crises and destruction of capital. End quote. Marx, Capital Volume 3, end footnote. And this is still a quote from Marx here that I'm reading. The more this contradiction develops, the more does it become evident that the growth of the forces of production can no longer be bound up with the appropriation of alien labor, but that the mass of workers must themselves appropriate their own surplus labor. Once the workers themselves appropriate their own surplus labor, and disposable time thereby ceases to have an antithetical existence, and disposable time therefore ceases to have an antithetical existence, then on one side, necessary labor time will be measured by the needs of the social individual, and on the other, the development of the power of social production will grow so rapidly that, even though production is now calculated for the wealth of all, disposable time will grow for all. Disposable time will grow for all. For real wealth is the developed productive power of all individuals. The measure of wealth is then not any longer, in any way, labor time, but rather disposable time. Labor time as the measure of value posits wealth itself as founded on poverty. Labor time as the measure of value posits wealth itself as founded on poverty. And disposable time is existing in and because of the antithesis to surplus labor time. And disposable time is existing in and because of the antithesis to surplus labor time. Or the positing of an individual's entire time as labor time, and his degradation therefore to mere worker, subsumption under labor. End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. This then is Marx's analysis of the historical changes which are brought about by machinery in the capitalist process of production. It is hardly necessary today, in the course of a new industrial revolution, to emphasize the prophetic significance of this enormously dynamic and essentially optimistic conception. For the dreams of the isolated German revolutionary in his exile in London in 1858, for the dreams of the isolated German revolutionary in his exile in London in 1858 have now, for the first time, entered the realm of what is immediately possible. Today, for the first time in history, thanks to the developments of modern technology, the preconditions for a final and complete abolition of the, quote, theft of alien labor time, end quote, actually exist. Furthermore, the present period is the first in which the development of the productive forces can be carried so far forward that, in fact, in the not too distant future, it will be not labor time, but rather disposable time by which social wealth is measured. Whereas previously all methods for increasing the productivity of human labor proved themselves in capitalist practice to be at the same time methods involving increasing degradation, subordination, and depersonalization, today technological development has reached a point where the workers can be finally liberated from the, quote, serpent of their agonies, end quote, from the torture of the assembly line, from fast and monotonous subdivided work, and instead of being the appendages of the production process, become the production process's real superintendents. There has never been a time when the conditions for a transformation to a socialist society have been so ripe. Socialism has never been as indispensable or economically feasible as socialism is today! Exclamation point. One is reminded of the trite bourgeois objection, according to which socialism must collapse from the necessity of carrying out hard and unpleasant tasks, which everyone tries to unload onto someone else. Footnote. Blanqui had already maliciously remarked that the objection of the bourgeois critics, which runs, quote, who empties the chamber pots under socialism, is in fact reducible to the simple question, quote, who will empty my chamber pot? End footnote. Such an objection, based on the nature of the normal bourgeois person, must appear laughable in the face of today's unprecedented development of the productive forces. Naturally, as long as water had to be carried into the house in buckets, there could have been few people who did not try to impose this drudgery on someone else. However, the construction of water pipes made the profession of water carrier superfluous. It is now clear that the development of technology works towards a situation where the previous crippling division of labor and its accompanying drudgery disappears, and where, in its place, labor can be posed as the free activity of mental and physical powers. To go back to a witty comparison made by Trotsky, just as it would be stupid for boarders at a good hotel with plentiful lunch to squabble over butter, bread, and sugar, so in the new society, the exploitation of person by person, the, quote, theft of alien labor time, end quote, would appear senseless and economically pointless. Not until then will the construction of a really classless, really socialist society be finally secured.